I'm Paulina Leiser, producer of Focus Today. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to check our other videos at theDove.us.
Well, welcome to Focus Today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson, and what an honor to have with us today. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. Dr. Jerry Johnson with us today. He is the president and the CEO of the National Religious Broadcasters, and he is the warrior for all of us in Christian broadcasting. He's out there on the front line. In fact, he's moved the front line all the way to Scotland today. What are you doing over there? Good to see you, Jerry.
Well, very good to hear your voice. Thanks for being a part of NRB, National Religious Broadcasters. INRB is Intercollegiate NRB, and we just finished a 2-week Oxford Distinguished Scholars Term where some of our broadcasting students did one-on-one tutorials like they do at Oxford. They did it with an Oxford Don, and they worked on their skills, their academic skills, their media skills. And then next week, we're filming some interviews with Eric Metaxas and Walter Hooper and Michael Ward. So I'm taking a little vacation in between, and I'm in Edinburgh today.
Well, good for you. Thank you for your time, for being with us, and thank you for your service, by the way. I know you guys are on the front line, a lot going on. You made the comment before we went on the air, these are changing times fast. Did you ever think, Dr. Johnson, we would see in America what we see today, and especially with the Supreme Court making these decisions?
Well, I didn't think that, 5 years ago, certainly not 10 years ago, but about a year or two ago, I was saying that, what I see around the corner is just exactly this kind of government censorship, government pressure. It's coming, and the church has to wake up and get involved.
What is your first reaction? Because I know you're writing a 3-part series and a commentary on the Supreme Court decision, and you call it the Supreme Shame. What's your gut reaction to overturning the definition of marriage? Well,
that first piece, my primary concern as a Christian is theological or doctrinal or biblical. And the fact is, that marriage goes back to the beginning. We're not talking about even the law. We're talking about the first page, the first chapter of the Bible. And part of what it means to be created a human being in God's image is that he created us male and female. And so this notion of this manufactured idea of same-sex so-called marriage, it's a rejection of the Creator and the created order for human sexuality. That's actually Paul's argument in Romans chapter 1. He doesn't go back to the law in Leviticus and where it says it's an abomination. Paul goes back and says, this is turning away from the Creator, turning away from the created order for human sexuality. And so, I just know something that wrong can never be legally right. And that's actually what Martin Luther King Jr. said, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, that, unjust laws can never be morally right. So I think there's my initial reaction as a Christian is, this cannot stand. It will either bring the country down or we'll have a great renewal and a great revival and a great awakening, and it could be reversed.
All right, let's go down that road just for a moment. There is now rumblings that it may be challenged based upon the fact that 2 of the justices shouldn't have made an opinion, and there may be some pushback. It could come from a state level. From your intelligence, do you think that's a possibility?
Well, the third piece I'm working on here is about the shambles. It's actually, the Supreme Court has opened the door, Perry, for a lot of confusion. And so, look at Roe versus Wade. So this was a decision, back in the 70s, 1973. And I remember when Time magazine marked that, it said, the pro-abortion or the pro-choice side won in 1973. They've been losing ever since. That's what Time magazine said. That is, you've got parental notification, ultrasound, waiting periods and so forth, admitting privileges, pain-capable acts and so forth, partial birth abortion bans. So what this court has done is very similar. This is a broad, sweeping decision, sort of, just legalizing so-called same-sex marriage. And now what you're going to see, Perry, is state by state, court by court, institution by institution, wrangling and strife over this. And I'm not making any predictions. I don't know what's going to happen there. I just know that, it was the wrong thing, and, much harm is going to follow.
Well, we also know, Dr. Johnson, that Pandora's box now been opened. We see the case coming out of Idaho for polygamy, and any other aberration is coming at us. Are we prepared for this?
My top concern is obviously religious liberty, freedom of religion, or just to put it in layman's terms, the freedom to believe. What we're talking about is infringing the government, enforcing this view. They're impinging upon people's freedom to believe and to act on those beliefs, to obey the scriptures as they understand them. And so this comes close at home to you because, in the hearings, Justice Alito asked the president's attorney in the debate before the Supreme Court, what's going to happen if Christian institutions don't do or recognize or hire people, that are part of these ceremonies? Is it going to be an issue? The Solicitor General, Varela, said it's going to be an issue. It's certainly, he said, certainly going to be an issue. And what this means is ministries that have a 501c3 tax-exempt status, that's going to be at jeopardy now. I think broadcasters like you and many others who have some kind of FCC license, I just believe that's going to be at risk now. And then, of course, for our Christian colleges and universities that have accreditation through the Department of Higher Education, coming down to the Southern Association of College and Schools, the North Central. Accreditation is going to be linked to this federal policy. And I think we're going to see a huge infringement on religious liberty, the freedom to believe.
I think you're spot on. Tough question, but how did this happen under our watch?
Well, there are all sorts of political explanations. Obviously, bad political appointments to the Supreme Court. These are presidential appointments. And so, in one sense, one or two justices would make all of the difference. And so you had certainly some Obama appointees and some Clinton appointees, but you also had some Bush appointees. And so, we need to insist upon, conservative politicians, particularly presidents, that will appoint strict constitutionalists to the bench. That's the first thing. But back of that, Perry, there is a spiritual decline that's reflected in this. And so we can't just blame the White House. We need to go to God's house. We need to go to the church and say, this is about the church in decline. This is about us losing our influence in the culture. This is about us failing in many ways to model marriage, to teach marriage. And so it's about the secularization of America. I heard Rick Warren say recently, America will either have a third great awakening or we'll go the way of Europe. And so I think we're partially to blame, and that's why it's our responsibility to make things right.
There's just been creeping deterioration, as you know, Dr. Johnson. In fact, during the NRB this past year, the internet bill came down and moved it over into a utility, which basically means now coming at us will be content control, which means any faith-based website could be taken down because it has content that would be offensive. Wasn't that really the unlocking of the door?
Yeah, that is the opening of Pandora's box because, I mentioned the IRS, the Department of Higher Education, or the FCC, but the internet has been this wonderful thing that's not had any kind of regulation or taxation. So by making the internet now more or less a utility by government classification, they're able to regulate it. to govern it, to tax it, to control it. And you're going to see the same kind of regulation you see with the FCC. I don't think this is a good thing. I mean, already China censors internet content. Saudi Arabia censors internet content. You have these kind of repressive regimes that are doing it. And, I'm very concerned because last year, someone petitioned the FCC, to pull the license of any station that used the word Redskins on the air. And, the FCC has authority when it comes to profanity and nudity. But this was the elevation. This was the idea of now, there's certain terms, there's certain, there's hate speech, there are these speech codes. And I'm very concerned with this marriage ruling mixed with this internet regulation measure. I'm very concerned that you stir that pot up and all of a sudden, you're right, you're going to have censorship of the web. We've already got censorship on Facebook and Twitter and Google, and we've documented that at NRB. That's industry censorship. But now we're going to go to the level, I think, of government censorship. It's not a good place to be.
All right, let me take a break here, Dr. Johnson, and we'll come back. I want you to explain to us, from your perspective, where has this taken us Christian broadcasters? Because we're all sitting here going, wow. And as you know, the Spectrum deal's after some of us television guys. I mean, we're in a real spot here, and I'd like to hear your comment. We'll be right back with Dr. Jerry Johnson. We're Skyping him in from Scotland. And so we'll be right back with him in just a moment. Okay, we're back. And again, what an honor for us to have with us today Dr. Jerry Johnson. He is the president and CEO of the National Religious Broadcasters, the NRB. We're Skyping him in from Scotland today. He's over there on some projects and the warrior of what we do in Christian broadcasting, and he leads the charge. And what an honor it is to serve with him. But I tell you what, these are different days. And I want to hear from you, Dr. Johnson, just your overall thinking. Where is this going to go for us broadcasters? Because you had mentioned these decisions probably will affect 501(c) status, but it probably will first go to education, and it'll have a lot to do with whether or not transferability, grants, etc. It probably will interject into the internet, as we talked about, content control. Then I always thought, well, then they would come after our microphone and cameras before they go to the pulpit, but all of them seem to be on the target list. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would. I mean, I'm reminded that before the Nazis strung up Bonhoeffer with piano string, the first thing they did, he was speaking on the radio and they cut the microphone. They literally flipped a switch to turn him off as he was speaking, for the confessing church, the church that wouldn't go along, the church that was objecting. And so, I think we better get serious about this, defending free speech. That's the reason NRB came to exist in the 1940s. It was about censorship on the radio. And here we are again, back to the future. I think this is, for the next decade, it's going to be our agenda. But I am encouraged, Perry, that, two governors have done something that's very instructive. Governor Bobby Jindal down in Louisiana, Governor Sam Brownback in Kansas, they've issued executive orders saying that in their state, no state agency may discriminate against any faith-based or any individual or any business or any ministry or any school that holds to the one man, one woman marriage view. And so what that's done is immediately, given, more or less marching orders to all state regulators, state employees, that they can't force this, on people down the line. What we're working on right now with Senator Lee of Utah is a federal type of a measure. and it's called the First Amendment Defense Act. It would essentially prohibit any federal agency from pulling a license, pulling accreditation, pulling tax-exempt status for those of us who have the view that the president said, actually, that he had, even for his reelection. He was still saying he believed that marriage was between one man and one woman. What we're saying is we hold that view. We should not be discriminated against. And I think we need to push for this bill. I really do.
He's going to sponsor. Does he have any other co-sponsors lining up, you know?
He does. He does in the Senate. So what we need is folks just to, generate grassroots support. It's called the First Amendment Defense Act. And they should write their senator or congressman, call, email, whatever you do to get attention. But this is one worth, raising, because it would, even if it doesn't pass, it raises awareness. Even if the president vetoes it, it raises awareness. And I think that's very important. They need to know we're watching. They need to know we're pushing back. And it needs to get on the presidential agenda. We've got presidential elections in a year. And, I asked publicly Bobby Jindal a few weeks ago in a meeting, what would you do as president to protect our First Amendment freedoms? And Jindal answered immediately, on day one, I would sign an executive order prohibiting any discrimination against Christian groups on this issue for licensing, for permits, and so on and so forth. So that was the right answer. I have no doubt some of the other candidates would do the same thing, but that's the answer we need to demand and that we need to seek.
Okay, but in the meantime, we have governors that may be taking the state pressure off. But the way it sits today, Dr. Johnson, the FCC could come after us licensees, right?
Well, and look, we've got to be real about this. We've watched this, Perry, in the last few years. The federal government has already had a new position on marriage. They've already had a new position in the administrative branch. So if you look at the military, we've gone from, no same-sex activity to don't ask, don't tell. And so now the full endorsement, of this view. Same thing with the State Department and the White House. So this is the official position of the federal government now. Now that the Supreme Court has ruled this way, it is not a leap, it is not a jump at all for the IRS to say, if you don't agree with this policy, if you don't function in accordance with this policy, you're not acting in the public interest. You can't be a 501c3. They did that with Bob Jones years ago because they had an interracial dating policy. You'll remember that. And they said, you're not acting in the public interest, and you're going to lose your tax-exempt status if you don't allow interracial dating. Well, that's another issue. I don't want to get into it. But it shows in principle they've made that maneuver before. And I'm very concerned. We know that the FCC already has the tools in the toolbox when it comes to indecency, when it comes to profanity, and we need to be watching. And that's why NRB is in D.C. We are watching. We are raising our voice. We're applying the pressure.
All right. Is there a coalition, Dr. Johnson, between the NRB and the NAB? Because what is affecting the NRB certainly is going to affect the NAB. It seems now that these two organizations have to come into some form of a coalition to go after these rights.
Yeah, I have been meeting and talking some with Gordon Smith, and then our vice presidents with his. We're working together when we can, and on these kinds of issues, we're on the same track. And Gordon Smith reminded me of something recently, which I will remind you and our listeners, and that is the Supreme Court has already ruled in the past that the media can use the media to defend the media, and we still do have a microphone. We're doing this today. But until they literally flip the switch, I think it's very important for pastors to use their pulpits, for radio and television and bloggers and podcasters to talk about this issue. Because, when the New York Times had reporters that were put in jail because they wouldn't divulge sources, there was a case which said, could they actually talk about that in the Times? And they did. They actually, defended their position. But I think, in fact, we have to be willing to use this megaphone to defend the megaphone. I think that's very important.
what would you say to pastors and churches? Because one of the things we're having, and I've been trying to convey to our audience, because we hold these federally issued licenses, FCC license, broadcast licenses, and all the things that you just mentioned, a lot of pastors will look at all of this as nothing more than politics and thinks they ought to stay away from it. But what the culture has done very successfully is taken all the tenets of faith, politicized them in an attempt to keep us away from it. But we're in a whole new world today. What's your thoughts?
Well, preachers used to preach on issues. Somewhere along the way, Perry, issues became politics. And that was a subtle move that the mainstream media and the left used to more or less demonize, those with conservative views on the issues. But think about it. The abolitionists were driven by pulpiteers. That's true in England. Over here in the UK, where I am, you look at John Newton, you look at William Wilberforce. These were Christian men with Christian motivations that fought the slave trade. You can look at that in the United States as well. The abolitionists were Christian people using Christian arguments. You look at Martin Luther King Jr., the Civil Rights Movement. He used Christian arguments, theological arguments, if you read the letter from a Birmingham jail. And so I think, there's a great tradition of Christian ministers making Christian arguments about public policy. There's nothing wrong with that. That's normal. But somehow, they've put us on the defense. And I just think we have to reassert the offense here.
One last question, because I know you're on a tight schedule. Where is the balance in your mind, Dr. Johnson, between potentially civil disobedience on these issues and revival?
Yeah. Well, look, it's always right to talk about Jesus wherever you are. And I would remind your listeners, where you're working, where you go to school, it's always right to talk about Jesus. We know that from the book of Acts. Twice they were told not to do it, and they said, we will obey God rather than men. And so that's the first and most basic thing I would say. But secondly, we're blessed to be in America. We still have a First Amendment. We still have the Constitution. That's high ground. The Constitution begins with we the people. This still is a self-governing nation. That is what the Constitution says. These people are our representatives. We have instruments of impeachment. So I think, we are all part of the government. We need to be engaged. And, nobody trumps the Constitution, not even the Supreme Court.
Wow, well said. Well, thank you, my friend. I know you're on a tight schedule. And again, open invitation for salmon and steelhead fishing in the Pacific Northwest.
Let's do it, Perry.
When you get back home, let's hook up, okay?
All right. Thanks so much.
All right, God bless you, pal. All right, we'll be right back.